Hello everyone, thank you for this second episode of our subject, an organization from a psychic perspective, and with this same French-speaking group, we begin our second session. To start, we could talk about this aspect of reconnecting with the essence of Auroville. If we can imagine that Auroville was created for a particular purpose some 50-odd years ago, as an intentional spiritual community, what about today? Is it possible to rekindle a bit of this spiritual or psychic flame within the community?
Bakwandas. First, I would like to say that we must remember that Mother clearly told us that the collective organization of Auroville was an extremely difficult thing to achieve. She said it was even more difficult than inner realization. So we're starting from a point that has never been done before in the evolution of humanity, and currently, talking about collective organization, which is actually the crucial point of our evolution in this wonderful project that is Auroville, calls upon criteria that are obviously spiritual in nature, but here again we would need to define what spiritual means. There is an interview where Mother speaks in response to someone asking her how one can know when they're having spiritual experiences, and Mother responds that as soon as you have an aspiration and you try to do your best. I'm obviously summarizing here. And you feel an inner translation of well-being and joy, we can say that this is the beginning of a spiritual experience. So this notion, for me, of returning to the Auroville Charter, which is still our guiding principle and which summarizes the vision of Auroville in its first part, is fundamental because it actually provides a point between these two parts, that Auroville belongs to nobody in particular but to humanity as a whole, but to stay in Auroville, one must be the willing servitor of the divine consciousness. Here, I believe there is a fundamental reflection that we could examine in a much more concentrated and conscious way at the collective level, and see where we stand in relation to this notion of being a servitor of the divine consciousness. This spiritual dimension of Auroville is surely the crucial point for each individual to truly participate in their individual evolution, but also in the collective organization of something that is really in relation to the Auroville Charter. So personally, I would like us to have a much deeper reflection already on this first point of the Auroville Charter and see where it might lead us.
Claude. For my part, I am quite astonished by many Aurovillians' lack of knowledge of both Mother's agenda and Sri Aurobindo's essential works. So putting these back at the center of Auroville in one way or another, I don't know how, would seem to me to be a good idea.
Kripa. Could you elaborate please when you say it should be put back in one way or another? Could you propose what you have in mind? How do you see things being put back to what you mentioned?
Claude. I don't really have a solution right now, just an observation. So could it first happen through the schools? That would surely be a first point. Then regarding adults, it's very difficult to impose anything, so in what way could we bring people to recognize that both the agenda and Sri Aurobindo's works are the essence of Auroville? I don't know, for now I don't have an answer. Perhaps try to develop more study circles.
Kripa. This is a subject that has been discussed, rediscussed, reflected upon, and has been at the heart of things for years and years, especially in the context of education, since there were discussions in the agenda with Mother herself about this. There was Karit who accompanied us, who guided Auroville's teachers and educational accompaniers in schools for many years, reflecting on the role of teachers and how to accompany children and how to bring Mother and Sri Aurobindo's teaching to children in a more living way. And one of the primary rules of teaching is that nothing can be taught. So it's not obvious at all because the moment you make it into a subject, you make it something external, you make it a lesson, you make it something that becomes something to be learned, so it's no longer alive at all and isn't at all the objective of Mother and Sri Aurobindo's work. So teaching it in schools, no way. I think that since the beginning, and what would bring about change, since we say we can only teach by example and you fully live what you are, and because you vibrate, because you are, you will set a certain example and the child will want to follow that example. So it would require that the adults themselves and the teachers themselves, people who are in education, and not just them, since in Auroville we're talking about a society where everyone is a teacher and everyone is a student in turn, and depending on circumstances and situations, everyone would need to, and here I agree with what you were saying earlier about returning to point number 1 of the charter, be a willing servitor of the divine consciousness. So actually, when you come to join Auroville and you decide to join Auroville, there's a moment when you have a personal and inner approach. But what form it takes in some people and what form it takes in others is very personal. In short, I have worked in many different schools, and I must say that the free progress system that is applied at last school convinces me quite well as a system, since history is approached through different texts of Sri Aurobindo. It's not exactly the text itself that is studied, and depending on the ages and the students' requests, there might be this book that is read in a group, a reading group on this book, or on this subject or that subject. But otherwise, we can approach poetry, we can approach literature, we can approach philosophy, we can approach history through Mother and Sri Aurobindo's texts. So in fact, it becomes living material even in teaching in this sense.
Bhagwandas. I would just like to return to this point about the first part of the charter, which is truly fundamental. Servitors of the divine consciousness, we must remember that at the very beginning of Auroville, among the people who were there were people like Roger, architects who were communists, and when Mother gave the charter, this matter of servitors of the divine consciousness raised a lot of issues, because some said, we're not here for that, a divine to a communist, that means nothing. So Mother changed it, she said we'll say perfect consciousness. And I think this capacity of Mother to readjust things according to circumstances, to go to the essence of what she is expressing, for me, it is indeed an aspiration to become. It's no coincidence that she called Auroville's first community aspiration. And I think fundamentally, it's this aspiration that needs to be reactivated in Auroville's collective process, also around this element of goodwill, because here too, from the moment there is true goodwill that goes beyond judgments, beyond racial differentiations, well, all the elements we know automatically place us in a process of seeking unity. And I think that's what's within reach of all working groups, that is, to organize around an inspiration, almost a principle that means we are here to go further in our quest for truth. And it doesn't matter if the result is red, blue, green, what's important is this aspiration, this inner fire, I think, that Mother wanted to give through Servitor of the Divine Consciousness. And at that point, indeed, it makes it much more accessible to implement collectively.
Alan. The difficulty is that there's no trick to it. And I think what works best perhaps is creating an atmosphere. And I think from this point of view, at last school, they've achieved something because there's an atmosphere that's created with an intention to give children the opportunity to be somewhat immersed in it. And I think the atmosphere is very important. Otherwise, the difficulty we have is that willing servitor of the divine consciousness, when we see what it represents, we measure the distance. Mother had said this to someone had said to Mother, "Mother, I want to serve you." And Kiri told me, she said to them, "Do you know that it's very difficult to be at the level where you can serve me?" So we're really still at the ABCs. That's what's most important for me. I think we need to manage to create an atmosphere. And I think at the collective level, what we're talking about organization, it's very significant because in Auroville, we've built loads of buildings in all directions. We've never made a center that would be for the Auroville community. A place that would be dedicated to giving maximum possibilities, spaces, tools for this community to manifest and express itself. Because the Unity Pavilion, we've seen what that finally led to anyway. I don't want to criticize those who designed this place, but it's kind of a classroom in a way. And what Auroville needs is really a space that allows many Aurovillians to come together. Because Satprem had made the observation that Mother works well when you're all together. And well, we have to recognize that overall, all this is quite mysterious. Because fundamentally, what is this story? What are these beings who should create the intermediate being, the superhumanity? It's something very mysterious ultimately. And indeed, how do we do it? Basically, it's not a trick, but how do we do it? What can help this become a major, natural preoccupation for many Aurovillians? That's the question.
Elisa. For me, when you mentioned Bhagwandas, the first part of the charter, the first movement was towards the interior and emptiness. And it reminded me of when I was a member of the council a few years ago, and at one point, I was observing all this governance machine that we had put in place, which had a particular force, even beyond individuals and their individual intention. And at one point, what came to me very clearly was, can we stop everything? Can we stop a system that we've put in place and make room for emptiness? And at the same time, with the very clear and firm intention of coming together as a community and starting to extract, and I like the idea, it connects with what Alan just shared, to explore what we have deep inside us, in creative ways, in many forms actually. But what comes to us when we sit together with the intention of redesigning our experience of collective organization? And what if we had nothing? What if we didn't even capture a council, a committee? Because even for me, this kind of structure, at least today, with the consciousness we have, my experience is that as soon as we created groups, there was a head that detached from the body, there was like a mental that thought about the reality it had to. That is, if there was a subject on the table, the head took it mentally, but cut itself off from the body and the living feeling of the reality that was happening on the ground. And so, I could see us having this intention. Obviously it needs to be guided, obviously there need to be defined phases where we'll explore what would make sense for us. How could we also establish the fact of having a backbone? And we see that today, at least in Auroville, in the present reality, at least according to me, we're missing a backbone of what's essential, of what we would agree on. For example, the fact of not going towards violence or negative impacts against each other, whether it's at a psychological level, at a physical level, whether it's at different levels. So I would already see the fact of pausing and taking a break, the fact of having an intention together. And that, I find that just that would touch me deeply. To say to ourselves, we're here for an experiment, can we have fun creating something new? And from there, with predefined phases, to see how we extract the essential in order to see where we would start, to be able to, how would we organize ourselves if we were all individually and collectively free, joyful to co-create, what would make sense? What would make sense today? I have lots of things in mind, so it's a bit difficult to structure my thought. But there, I'll stop there for now.
Kripa. Can I ask you again to make a concrete proposal? I don't know where we currently stand in terms of the diversity of nationalities, but we have had up to 56 different nationalities until recently. With all these different nationalities come different languages, different traditions, different cultures, different ways of seeing things, of approaching each other, of expressing ourselves. Not everyone has the same level in a common language that we generally use collectively, namely English, etc. Here we find ourselves, dreaming together, sharing what we strongly desire, but then, concretely, I am a great organizer in my head at least, so I have all the ideas following each other saying, okay, that's great, what she is saying sounds amazing. But then, how do we implement it?
Elisa. When you asked me the question, I had fragments of ideas. These would need to be refined and we'd need to see what resonates truly. But for example, if we ask the community, what would be the essential values for our collective organization? Around which values, if we have to choose 3 to 5 core values on which to organize our collective organization in Auroville? And if we pose this question, and set up either online questions that people can answer, or have a space where people can come to draw, where people can come to express themselves. And actually, for me it's very, very important that we establish and reflect together, and feel together. So there can be different questions, but above all, we need to address what's essential. From what value, from what pillar, would we envision having this collective organization? And again, in a way that engages the mind, engages intuition, engages creativity, imagination. And once we have these values, for example, ask how they translate at different levels in the structure, or in the functioning, in practices, in meetings. So I don't have an answer with concrete content, I just see the process, and really just in these essential elements, so my answer might not satisfy your organizational aspect, but there can be questions for me where we start from the heart of what's important. What heart beats in Auroville in our organization? We are collectively a living being. What do we want to beat at the foundation? And do we want trust? Do we want sincerity? What do we feel? It's not even about what we want, but how can we serve? And how can this organization, how can I serve this organization, and how does this organization serve our individual and collective development? And start from the essential to move towards the layers where we define in an extremely concrete and extremely practical way certain things, the way we will once again structure ourselves, meet, make decisions. But all this gets designed together. I can see from your face that I'm not answering your question.
But Quandas, I really resonate with what you're saying, Alisa, and as Alan was also saying, it's indeed about creating an environment. In the very beginning of Auroville, in the first years, actually between 1970 and 1911, in this very chaotic organization where there were about 20 or 30 Aurovillians, we had found something. It was the mirror. We called it the mirror, and it was around the only tree that was at aspiration. So actually, our community revolved around this tree and everyone would pose their questions, would go to consult. It was actually a meeting point. So obviously, what's missing, as in any form of. Every society organizes itself around a constitution that works more or less well, at least in democratic societies. But Auroville cannot have a constitution. It has a charter. So, and this charter, we have a DNA that was given by Mother, but we don't yet have precisely this skeleton or this collective being that is sufficiently formed. And I think we can form it by putting precisely all our vital energy, our inspiration, our will into creating this other collective reality which is fabulous. When we manage to touch these points, and I believe we've all touched them at certain privileged moments, we are carried. It's a collective being that is born. It's not just our small individualities. We're around something, and as soon as there's a common inspiration, real listening, something that's there, well, it's like an intuition that rises up with results, concrete, material results. And I think the collective entity, which at present is very dislocated, would need a rediscovered will. So, rediscovering the DNA that was given to us through the charter, indeed, to be a true Aurovillian, mother's dream, all these fundamentals that are our DNA. And around that, having this kind of need, so creating this need, maybe indeed through a place where it would be easier to put energy and create dynamics. But something that starts in the collective like a living need through questions. As you were saying, Alisa, questions about how you see Auroville's evolution, through which elements. In 1968, in the famous May 68, there was something I really liked. It was imagination and power. Imagination, we lack imagination in Auroville, somehow. We need to rediscover things that are very accessible and mutually authorize ourselves to unleash our imagination, to be able to put it forward and confront it with that of others. So, indeed, finding a process, a place, a process where this spark can restart some of the initial spirit through another form, obviously.
Kripa. I just want to react to the statement that Auroville lacks imagination. I have a hard time with these generalizations. And I can't help but react. First, I think we can give ourselves a little pat on the back. We shouldn't forget that we're coming out of a major global pandemic where everything was put on pause, globally, collectively. Right after this pandemic, we had a huge crisis, and we're certainly not yet out of this big crisis in Auroville with the takeover of the administration, of Auroville's functioning, etc., and we're in a major internal crisis. So, indeed, our means of expression have been somewhat taken away from us these past few years. We haven't had the freedom, we haven't had the ability or the possibility to express ourselves and to move forward with physical manifestation, clearly, and in the manifestation of a collective project. And what I see is something much more subtle, much more just below the surface, like this discussion group. Well, there have always been these in Auroville, we can't say it's new, it's there and we're participating together. A network of mutual aid and solidarity, a renewal of having to position ourselves in relation to Auroville's ideals and the reason why we're here, that people who have been shaken for X, Y, Z reasons in their being, at whatever level, at the most psychological level, at the most material level, at the level of all the insecurities in these recent years, have decided to stay or not. So, some decide to stay for comfort, some decide to stay for idealism. I think we have been extraordinarily awakened at a certain level, individually and collectively. And there is certainly still a real blockage to being able to express things externally, but nothing prevents us from thinking, mobilizing, and being concrete and in real action about how the next phase will unfold. And I think we shouldn't just be nostalgic about the past, because the past is what built us, it's what made us what we are today, but we need to be invested in the present to build the future. And now, we're in a situation, how I perceive things in Auroville currently, in a key period, a really important and pivotal period, where precisely, it's crucial for me to think about how we reorganize ourselves, how we live Auroville, how we build Auroville, how we dream Auroville, and how we're going to continue to work on this manifestation of Auroville. So, how? And I want to come back to this individual responsibility with a collective responsibility, with taking individual responsibility while delegating certain parts to groups and to a collective functioning, because for me it's essential where each of us is responsible for what we do. We can't just say it's others, it's others, it's others. Each of us is a living cell of this body, and we have our responsibility in how we do things here. And we have the power to do it. We have that responsibility, not only from the start, but also in what Karit tried to manifest and do through the Auroville Foundation by specifying this residence assembly with all residents having a say in how Auroville functions. And again, when I say having a say, it's not just at the level of discussion, it's really in the manifestation. And so, I want to feel this energy too. How do we take the next step?
Elisa. I really have a feeling that when I look at the political world as it has been built in many countries and how it's mainly about the individual interests of political representatives, it deeply bothers me because we're not talking about the essential questions and values that we want to apply. We're talking about who, about which program. So, we're talking about extremely restricted individual interests. And there's something that would come to me. After that, for me, it's part of the content to gather in a process, but I could really see us, for example, in Auroville where we would have. Let's imagine that we have like a map of Auroville, but that we have several maps. But if, for example, there's a conflict and conflict management isn't handled by groups or by all that, but for example, there's a conflict and we're shown on the map, we would see online, that there's a situation here. Nobody needs to describe the situation, but we maybe need a mediator, we need emotional support, we need a. We describe roles and we have values and we have principles to apply in these roles. But then, the situation is managed by an ad hoc group that emerges because we need such and such function, such and such function, such and such function. And then, to decentralize. I have the impression that we need to move towards this decentralization, this localization where, and especially also use digital where ultimately, we put at the heart somewhere processes and for me, processes, I know some have had an allergic reaction to these words, but we put at the heart the interests, meaning that we're directly in service of the cause for which we're going to. That we're going to serve, actually. And there would be qualities to call for from the people who will come to support. And so, there are these ad hoc groups, but especially who will follow. Who will follow principles, values, ways of managing things. And we see how things happen and we document this information. And that means that our collective living also becomes more tangible and visible to us. And is no longer managed, in my opinion, by groups. I don't know why, but I really have this sensation that the groups Well, we need to move towards a renewal of that. And so, there are plenty of forms that we could experiment with. But again, for me, saying, pause, and giving ourselves the freedom to experiment with open questions would be the first steps.
But Qantas, I'll come back to imagination regarding what you said, Kripa. But first, I should echo what Elisa said. There's one thing, for example, that came to me that's been running through my head for a long time. It's creating a service bank in Auroville, also a knowledge bank, a bank of expertise. That is to say that each Aurovillian in themselves has an incredible value, and that Auroville's economy, which is based on money, should be based on what each person can give, actually. And it's enormous. All the possibilities that each person has, but that they can put into service. So, this bank, which generally manages through money, which is a big problem in Auroville, why wouldn't we have a bank, precisely, of service where each Aurovillian says, well, I can offer this service because I have the capacity to do massage or to paint or to do whatever. And we would have, multiplied by 100, 1,000, all these capabilities that would be at our service, actually. That means we would have a collective body that suddenly would have thousands of arms or possibilities. So, well, that's one thing, but it's true that when I speak of imagination, I agree with you. Aurovillians are full of imagination and full of beautiful things, but at the collective level, I find that we lack imagination and that we don't dare enough to create conditions, create tools that will allow, indeed, to change our relationship and our objectives. And so, well, imagination, it's true that it's intuitive, it comes from higher planes. So, that means that indeed, we need to start by gathering around things where we really listen to each other, like we're doing now and like other groups do. Something always happens. We should tell people, look, let's start with that. Let's start listening to each other and put forward topics that are precisely of this order. What are the priorities that we would need at the present time where people could help? So, there are concrete points that could be interesting to explore, maybe not in this meeting, but in any case, the very principle of this.
Dan. I would like to draw a parallel between the individual and the collective, because for me, an organization exists as soon as there is more than one person. Organization is needed as soon as there's a friendship, a couple relationship, a work group, a family. And I think that on an individual level, the state of consciousness of the individual determines their actions. That is to say that when an individual, I'll take my case in particular, when I understand something, I can't act as if I don't understand it. So that my understanding of what's happening, my state of consciousness determines my subsequent actions. And I think that in Auroville, the organization is gradually taking shape also because the state of consciousness of individuals and the collective is changing. And here, we come back to the theme of these conversations, organization from a psychic perspective. I think we are, in a way, witnessing the birth of a collective psychic somewhere. And which is made up of the union of all these psychic influences of individuals, which means that something is happening. We don't really know in what form it will reveal itself, but I'm quite optimistic in any case from this perspective.
Kripa. I would like to remind that in Auroville, in daily life, we also have an extraordinarily ordinary life. That is to say that children go to school, there are schedules. When we go shopping, there's someone sitting at the counter behind the register. When we go to financial service, there must be someone sitting behind a desk. So in the collective organization, there's also an entire city, an entire society that must function with a certain foundation that is maintained. So there is rigor in the organization, in work, in structured schedules, etc. And alongside that, there's also how we think and how we organize. Currently, what is a working group? What is decision-making? What is this? What is that? Which ends up creating almost a divide between the two. And in fact, it's the whole that needs to be brought together.
Alan. In fact, I've always had the feeling that in Auroville, there are two superimposed levels that have always existed. There is a level which is that of the natural and spontaneous cooperation of people, often around a leader in a project or things that people are interested in. And very often, this cooperation goes quite well. Where we have generally had difficulties is when we move to a level, I don't know if we can call it superior, where collective decisions have to be taken, and often at that point, it becomes difficult. Because at the bottom, it's a bit abstract. And I think that when Mother spoke about how the ashram was made, for example, she always said that it came spontaneously, there was a need, we did it. And there is something like that in Auroville that has always existed. And people appear who are inhabited by a certain vision, and then they do something. This kind of fairly spontaneous and natural movement, which in my opinion is a little bit the essence of Auroville, as I have known it. It's a kind of way of circulating. And a certain, as you said very rightly Kripa, the fact that many people here are responsible by themselves. That is to say, we don't give them orders, we don't tell them they have to be there at such and such an hour and everything. But there is a kind of consciousness, the teachers will be there and everything. It's this kind of discipline or attention, this atmosphere. In fact, I always come back to the idea of atmosphere. In fact, how do we create an atmosphere that gives this feeling of participating? We join with people, but I'm always a little worried when we try to organize these things too much. Because precisely, it's often there that things become difficult. I remember, I don't know if you remember, Bagandis, at one point, in Sair, there was a big problem. It's that someone had filed a complaint against Kirat and me, who had supposedly tried to collect tons of crores, an education minister, a deputy minister, who had filed a complaint. And as a result, the person in charge of the Sair file in Delhi summoned me and told me I'm coming to see your institute in 3 days because I want to understand. And Kirat told me, well, here, it's the chance for Sair where it's its loss, because this guy is a very honest guy, but very independent, and so we absolutely have to succeed. And he told me you go back to Auroville and you organize it. He had even given me very specific things. I had to look for the guy in Madras, and then I stop him halfway to take some coconut juice. Kirat, it was quite funny. And what happened to me as a personal experience is that those 2 or 3 days when I had to organize all of that a bit, there was this extraordinary impression of synchronicity, all the things fell into place. And all. I wanted to see someone, boom, he was there. And it's this kind of uprising, and I remember that finally, at the end of all that, I was a bit exhausted, and when I arrived with this guy in the meeting, there was a big meeting with all the researchers of Auroville, I started talking, I started to stammer, I was a bit lost. And this guy who was there, suddenly, he was sitting on a chair, while most of the people were sitting on cushions, and he said, well, wait for me. He sat on the floor and said, well, let's go. And I felt this kind of collective relief. We knew it was going to be fine. Because during the whole trip, I had shown him the Auroville plans. He had told me you have to show him the Auroville plans, you have to explain it to him. And I remember, it was funny, because I was a bit lost, I didn't really know what to say, and this guy did that. There are moments like that, they are moments of grace, and it's this kind of this feeling that we should live often, knowing that what's important is to catch this grace. Because finally, Mother had said, I remember Frederic had made a whole organization, and at one point, Mother said, well, as long as I'm here, it may not be necessary. It was quite funny, you see. And she had detailed, they had a meeting, then Mother said, yes, as long as I'm here, it's not necessary. And that's it, we have to remember that. We have to remember that, Mother, she's the Alpha and the Omega, period. After, how it translates, I don't know. Okay, when I listen to all this. Atmosphere.
Bakwandas. I do indeed believe that all these privileged moments that we have lived and will live are part of another plane. As you say, Mother's grace, it's something we constantly experience, and since the beginning of Auroville. There is a question, I believe it's in your questions, for those who haven't really come through a, let's say, spiritual approach, who don't really know, who aren't really interested in Mother and Sri Aurobindo's teachings. So it's true that this is a difficult question to answer, because we have to really think one thing, which is that at the beginning of Auroville, the people who came, they hadn't heard about the majority, 80% of Mother and Sri Aurobindo. They were, I wouldn't say atheists, but in fact people who were absolutely not in the search and understanding through the writings of Mother and Sri Aurobindo. And yet, they were the first Aurovillians, and they gave themselves with all their art and their reality without even understanding what Mother and Sri Aurobindo's vision was. Which came later on gradually for some but not for everyone. So we really have to relativize this whole spiritual approach, because in fact we don't really know what it is. On the other hand, what we know, well, at least in my experience, is that when we touch this point in ourselves and we have this sincerity to really do our best, to have goodwill, to try to go beyond judgments, well, the answer is really, really present and accelerates the process like nothing else. So yes, we are in divine potential, but in reality we really have a humanity that sticks to our skin, in which somewhere indeed doesn't really feel like venturing into elements that are a bit on the edge and we don't really know. It's a bit the unknown. And it's in this sense that I was talking about imagination. Imagination in the service of the unknown. But an unknown, we know, that carries us. It's the unknown, Mother, what she asked us to live in fact. But from experience, we know that it works. Another thing again, we mustn't forget that Auroville is on different planes. And that the plane we're talking about, the collective organization, is a plane where precisely there are all these resistances of our human incarnation in fact, and our egos and everything else. But somewhere beyond us, only the will to be there, the inspiration to be there, to hold on despite all the difficulties and to do what we have to do. Mother did say after all that it was to avoid a third world war that she had made Auroville. How can we imagine that this little Auroville, indeed in Mother's vision, could have avoided a third world war? And yet, I'm convinced of it. So somewhere it's true that these sharings among us could give us back the sense of this great Auroville, of this Auroville where things do not obey the same laws.
Alan. In fact, Eric told me that one day, he said to me, well anyway, Auroville has in any case avoided a third world war. He told me so. Yes, it's all quite mysterious. Moreover, not only that, but Mother said that a little over 2 years later, regarding the fact that Auroville wanted to avoid a world war, she said, but in fact it seemed to me a bit of a superficial explanation. And she says, in fact it was Sri Aurobindo himself who told me that in fact the reason why you created Auroville is because India consents to all human difficulties, and it is in India that these problems will be solved, and that's why you created Auroville. Well, when we look at that, we say wait, 1 second. I wanted to say that all the problems of the world, it is in India that they will be resolved, and it will be because there will be Auroville. Well, then we are more than in the mystery, we are in something.
Elisa. Well, this question regarding, I don't even know exactly how it was formulated, but about how to somehow see the resonance between the people who come from Auroville with the spirit of Auroville. For me, it's a question that has never really spoken to me, because I trust that something much greater than me brings people to Auroville, and that doesn't mean doing nothing. I think that somewhere what we have today as a seed of potential, but which can exist in a much more refined form. But the fact that people, for example, engage in Auroville, the people who arrive in Auroville engage and enter the collective body and try in this collective body, and that afterwards the returns of this living body come to say here this person, if particularly in case of problem, because for me it's that which poses problem to me. It's people at the time of the entry in Auroville. We have information elements where there are real serious problems, such as forms of violence or such as forms, and finally there are people who finally enter in Auroville, and we are not completely equipped in a certain dimension to manage this kind of problem. But afterwards, when I hear people today tell me, but how is it possible that there are people from Auroville creating a certain situation in Auroville? I did not sign up for that. I believe that we all have our place, and that even those who would bring certain situations here, we are somewhere, we are a laboratory that must welcome full of experiences, and I think that the more we welcome and the more we are expanded inwardly and collectively, the more we develop spiritual muscles and at the same time of manifestation in this matter. So for me I see a membrane, but which is almost a living membrane of letting the collective body speak of what can be taken and what cannot be taken, and above all also to trust that individuals will find their way, and somewhere there are also extractions that sometimes happen very naturally. And I would just like to come back to one thing with regard to knowledge. With regard to the knowledge of the texts of Mother and Sri Aurobindo, because it is true that at the very beginning I read a lot, but afterwards I completely stopped, and therefore I would not consider myself as someone who has an in-depth knowledge of the texts. But on the other hand, what was very funny is that what interested me was my inner experience and spontaneous. And so I was doing my experiments, and Paolo, my uncle, who was my spiritual library of Mother and Sri Aurobindo and others, but he translated to me, he drew a parallel to my experiences, and I found that very interesting, that I was living certain experiences and that he was referring me to the writings of the experiences of Mother and Sri Aurobindo. And so I think there are many forms of knowledge. In fact, there is this intellectual knowledge. But there are other forms of knowledge. There is an energetic, sensory knowledge. And I think it is important to have an integral vision on knowledge, in order not to privilege only one form of knowledge. That, for me, according to me, would be very important.
Bakwandas. There is one thing I would still like to add, and that is this somewhat occult relationship. I don't know the term, but something with the world. It's true that if we draw a parallel between the evolution of Auroville and the evolution of the world, we see that we are currently in a phase where Auroville is in deep resonance with the world in relation to what is happening outside and in relation to Auroville. And I often amuse myself by seeing the evolution of Auroville as a being with its different stages of evolution, and I believe that we are now indeed in a phase of a profound and necessary mutation. And this mutation, like in the world, I think it will go through another consciousness, another energy, but another consciousness that will awaken in beings, because after all, we have all these years of inner work, all these experiences that have accumulated somewhere. When Mother and Sri Aurobindo speak of the descent of the supramental, of this divine consciousness, I think that here we really have to reflect on how, so to speak, to remove our head, but to be very receptive to this element that is coming and that has been announced for decades and decades. So here again there is an unknown element, an almost unknown ingredient, but at the same time it will play a fundamental role, as we know, as Mother and Sri Aurobindo have told us, and which may take us by surprise in terms of awareness and capacities, possibilities that have been. We are a bit like a gestation. May I have a great gestation instead of being 9 months. It's 56 years, and that somewhere indeed at some point maybe something else will be born. In any case we can imagine it. And say that it is possible, because if there was one who was in the wonder and in the imagination and the possibility of seeing in the vision, obviously it is Mother in her dream and in her possibilities to always say forward, far forward. So let's also allow ourselves as a collective to open up to that.
Dan. Well, we'll end on this positive note. Thank you, and see you again soon.
Thank you for listening to this testimonial. If you would like to take part in this project on the inner being, or if you have any questions or comments for our team or participants, please feel free to contact us using the email at the bottom of this webpage.
This is Auroville Radio, voices from the city of dawn.